I've got another long journey ahead of me, but it seems that the destination is well worth the temporary discomforts of the road. And really, are they even discomforts? Just look at the beauty around us. I've been to the place I'm heading to before, and the first time I was there, it was in the company of some truly amazing people. I still do remember our late-night discussions of Malevich on the banks of the Tiber. This time, I'll be on my own, but I hope I'll have enough time to show you a bit of the city to which all roads lead. Let's go! I certainly don't want to claim that this is a comprehensive tour of Rome. This time, I didn't manage to visit many places I wanted to, so don't limit yourself to just what I have shown. There are plenty of standard Roman walks, but today I wanted to show you things that often go unnoticed, although I still couldn't resist including a few classic landmarks. This walk turned out to be quite lengthy, but could it really be otherwise in Rome? So I had to split it into two parts, just like in London. Links to both episodes and a map of the walk, as always, will be in the video description, and you can adapt it to your own preferences. Oh, and speaking of preferences, I've discovered that some of the videos from this channel have already been stolen. So with some surprise, I remind you that if you're watching this video anywhere other than on the Pro Rookie channel on YouTube, you've unfortunately stumbled upon a counterfeit. And of course, all interactions, correct links and other videos in this series will be here. As I think I've already mentioned, the best part of such trips is not just wandering around the city, but also living like a local. So this time, I stayed in an ordinary city neighborhood. It's rather cozy, although I think the locals' flowers are likely doing better than mine. Let's not start with the well-known sights of Rome right away, but instead begin with the Milvian Bridge. I bet many of you have never even heard of it, yet it played a crucial role in the conversion of Christianity into the state religion of the Roman Empire. The bridge dates back to the 3rd century BC, although it was wooden at the time. It became stone only in 109 BC. Over the years, it has suffered from earthquakes and the passage of time, but it witnessed many historical events as it was the route taken by armies going off to war and returning, awaiting permission to enter Rome in a triumph on the nearby field of Mars. And here we have a battle where the future Emperor Constantine defeated the usurper Maxentius. Later, Constantine not only managed to legalize Christianity in his empire, but to build a basilica in Trevi, which I have already shown in a separate episode, and even build the walls of Constantinople. This is the very battle where Constantine supposedly had a vision, although in reality it was Maxentius who made a series of blunders which ultimately led to his downfall. Today the battles have become much smaller, and the bridge is mostly known for clashes between fans of different Roman football teams. But the bridge itself still stands on one of those very roads leading to Rome. You might think of the Appian Way first, but this is another, the so-called Flaminian Way, along which I'll continue. Along it, you'll find a boulevard with stunning flowers, remnants of ancient buildings casually incorporated into modern walls. But Rome is a special place that you need to be prepared for. I wouldn't call it untidy, but Rome certainly isn't shy about its southern nonchalance. There might be rubbish lying around in the squares, grass growing between the stones of buildings, as if the mighty empire just stepped out for a moment and those tasked with looking after it got distracted by coffee. In other words, don't expect Rome to be sterile, though you can still drink fairly safely from any of the city fountains. The Flaminian Way, which on the other end goes to Rimini, leads to the so-called Porta del Popolo, the People's Gate on the square of the same name. It was once called Porta Flaminia after the road I came along and Porta San Valentino after the nearby catacombs. But when in 1099 Pope Pascal, the second with that marvelous name by the way, ordered a chapel to be built here with public funds, it led to another renaming of the gate. The gate has been rebuilt several times, so in engravings from different years it looks different. Each restoration and rebuild was marked by a plaque, and on the inner facade there's also a mention of the abdicated and newly converted to Christianity Queen Christina of Sweden, entering through them in 1655. In the middle of Piazza del Popolo stands an Egyptian obelisk, ancient even by Roman standards. It's about 3,500 years old, with hieroglyphic texts praising Pharaoh Ramses II the Great. He's the one who built the famous Abu Simbel temple, where Pharaoh Ramses II worships the god Ramses II, meaning that as a ruler he worships himself as a god. If you remember, thanks to the relocation of Abu Simbel, Madrid received the Temple of Dibod. I covered this story in the episode about the Spanish capital, and you'll find the link to it up here. The obelisk was brought to Rome by Octavian Augustus in 10 BC to mark the conquest of Egypt by Rome, and stood for a long time in the Circus Maximus before being moved to the center of Piazza del Popolo at the end of the 16th century. At the ends of the square's main axis are two fountains by Giovanni Ceccarini from the first third of the 19th century, the Fountain of Neptune and the Fountain of Rome. The former for some reason isn't working right now, but the latter is merrily bubbling away. However, you can also get water in the center. The Egyptian obelisk is now surrounded by a fountain, with replicas of the lions standing on the Capitoline Hill. But before them, there was also a fountain there. There's another theory about the square's name, which until the early 19th century served as a place for public executions. Popolo also means poplar. So there's a theory that before the square was laid out in the late 16th century, these trees grew here. But honestly, I prefer the version about the chapel and the church of Santa Maria del Popolo built on this site right next to the gate. The still existing fairly small church is usually overlooked, although it's far more significant than the other churches on the square. Relatives of Roman popes were buried here, and both Raphael, Bramante and Bernini were involved in its construction. And inside, there are, for example, paintings by Caravaggio. The main, and quite undeserved compared to the Church of St. Mary, attention on the square is drawn to the two almost symmetrical churches of Santa Maria del Miracoli and Santa Maria in Montesanto from the late 17th century. Previously, there were burial monuments from the era of Octavian Augustus in the form of pyramids, serving as a grand entrance to the field of Mars. And now, behind the churches, the roads diverge towards the Mausoleum of Augustus to Piazza Venezia, but I'll take the third, Via del Babuino, to the Spanish Steps and Bernini's boat fountain. On the way, look at the church of the Greek Catholic community, with services in Greek. On the way, you can take a slight detour to Via del Condotti and visit the famous Caffè Greco, the third oldest in Europe, a favorite haunt for the artistic bohemia. Since 1760, Goethe and Byron, Liszt and Bizet, Gounod and Grieg, Nietzsche and Stendhal, Mark Twain and Thomas Mann, Hans Christian Andersen and Guillaume Apollinaire have all dropped by here. And if English literature is more your cup of tea, on this same Piazza di Spagna stands the house where the English poet John Keats lived and died. It's now a museum with relics, letters and paintings dedicated not only to Keats himself and his friend Percy Shelley, but also to Byron, Elizabeth Browning and Oscar Wilde, whom I mentioned in this episode about London. Before we head up, the main attraction, and this time quite deservedly so, is the Fontana della Barcaccia. Everyone knows it was created by Bernini, but not everyone remembers that it was made by two Berninis, Pietro and his son Gian Lorenzo, commissioned by Pope Urban VIII. The challenge in creating the fountain was that the aqueduct from 19 BC, which feeds the fountain, couldn't create a strong pressure. So notice that the fountain is sunk below street level. And yes, it's also drinkable. There's yet another city legend about the shape of the fountain, this time more likely true, that in 1598, during one of the frequent floods of Tiber, a small boat was brought here, and after the water receded, it remained on the Piazza di Spagna. The square and the steps get their name from the nearby Palazzo di Spagna, just over there a bit further on the right of the column. This former palace of the Monaldeschi family was bought by Spain in 1654 and has served as the Spanish embassy to the Holy See ever since. The Spanish steps lead up from the fountain to the rather elegant Church of Trinita dei Monti. Amusingly, you can't sit on the lower part of the steps anymore. There are now officials who politely ask you to stand up. And honestly, it makes a lot of sense. Otherwise, climbing up the stairs would be a right pain. Thankfully, it didn't seem to bother Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn in the least.
Why don't we do all those things together?
But don't you have to work?
Work? Now. Today is going to be a holiday.
At the very end of Via Sistina, there's a square boasting two creations by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. The first one that grabs your attention is of course the Triton Fountain, commissioned by none other than Pope Urban VIII, who also commissioned the Barcaccia Fountain. The odd, wide-eyed creatures at its base are surprisingly dolphins. I must say I find Bernini a tad disappointing here. Perhaps purge, but to distort dolphins so badly? As for Triton, I've never seen one, so I have no idea how he's meant to look, which means the main element of the fountain is entirely down to the artist's imagination. There's also another rather charming fountain by Bernini in the same square, though it's often overlooked. This is the so-called Fountain of the Bees, originally created with a very practical purpose, to water horses. You know, just as Florence can afford to misplace masterpieces by Michelangelo and Botticelli, do check out a separate episode on my channel, Rome can afford to water its horses with a fountain designed by Bernini. By the way, the three bees on the fountain are the symbol of the Barberini family, to which the fountain's patron, Pope Urban VIII, belonged. Next, I headed towards one of Rome's classic landmarks. Not exactly my favorite due to the crowds, but I'll talk more about that when we get there. Along the way, like in many other cities, Rome has numerous plaques commemorating Holocaust victims. This kind of respect is truly commendable. On the same route is the Church of Saints Claude of Besançon and Andrew. The church itself is not particularly remarkable compared to others, but from certain angles St. Claude looks, well, let's just say, rather surprised. You might find yourself similarly surprised if, as two guides like to do, they ask you to look in a certain direction at just the right moment so that where you're going suddenly reveals itself all at once instead of gradually. In Rome, this kind of unexpected grand reveal might very well be the Trevi Fountain. This is the largest fountain in Rome, nearly 50 meters long and over 26 meters high, and possibly the only one that uses the building behind it as part of its frame. The Palazzo Poli seems to rise out of the fountain, serving as its backdrop, with one of its corners appearing to be broken off and in its place a tree grows. The current fountain is far from the first version. Since the 19 BC, during the time of Marcus Agrippa, an aqueduct ran through here, which was restored by Pope Hadrian I in the 8th century. The history of the Trevi Fountain is closely intertwined with various popes who renovated it. Pope Nicholas V restored the fountain in the 15th century, and then Pope Urban VIII tasked Bernini with reworking it again, but Pope Clement XI rejected several designs until finally Pope Clement XII chose the design by Alessandro Galilei. However, as Galilei was a Florentine, the commission was handed over to the Roman, Nicola Salvi. In the end, after over 30 years of construction and opened by the next Pope, Clement XIII, the fountain features Neptune in a chariot drawn by two seahorses, hippocampi. One is calm, representing the peaceful sea, and the other is agitated, clearly representing a storm. Two female figures accompany them. A virgin who, according to a legend, pointed out the water source for the very first aqueduct, and abundance, symbolizing Rome. There are countless other details worth examining, from bas-reliefs to animals and plants, but to be honest, you need to come here at an off-peak time. Otherwise, you'll find yourself in a crowd, unable to fully appreciate this beauty. The one good thing about the crowds is that they toss nearly €4,000 into the fountain each day. All that money is said to go to help the needy in Rome. Next up, we've got a somewhat lesser known site in Rome, the Temple of the Deified Hadrian. The name might sound a bit grandiose, I agree, but that's exactly what it is. I'll be mentioning this emperor a few more times during this walk. Hadrian was one of the so-called 5 good emperors, under whom the Roman Empire reached its zenith. There's much to say about him, but I'll leave that to the Roman guides. For now, I'll just mention that after his death, he was deified, as was his favorite, Antinous, and this temple was built by Hadrian's adopted son and successor, Antonius Pius, in the mid-2nd century. Today, only a little of the original cladding remains. There are 11 columns and just one wall of the cellar, the north wall, which has been incorporated into the Roman Stock Exchange building. On our way to the next attraction, you might catch a glimpse of the street scene called Carabinieri chasing off junk peddlers. Next on my route is the rather intriguing Jesuit church of St Ignatius. It's named after none other than Ignatius Loyola, whom I mentioned in the episode on Alcalá de Henares. From the outside, the church doesn't seem to be anything special, just another Baroque building, much like the church of the Gesu, which we will see later. We've seen plenty like it. I actually did intend to give you a brief rundown on the transition from Renaissance to Baroque architecture here. But it was either too complex or too long-winded. It's the sort of thing you really need to see in person to fully appreciate. Rome is almost a perfect place for that. And if you can, bring along a professional architect. They're absolutely brilliant at explaining what entasis is or how fluting differs, so I'll leave that to the experts. You'll get the full story when you visit Rome yourself. But for now on, let's focus on what's inside the church, which is really the main attraction. First off, there's a tomb of Pope Gregory XV, the very pope who canonized Ignatius Loyola. But the real showstoppers here aren't the sculptures, it's the paintings. And the most famous one came about in true blessing in disguise fashion. You see, before the church was finished, Cardinal Ludovisi, whose funds were paying for the construction, passed away. The church was consecrated in 1642, but there wasn't enough money to build the dome. So, Andrea Pozzo was called in to do the paintings. Pozzo wasn't just a painter, he was also a mathematician and an astronomy enthusiast, all while being a Jesuit himself. His wide range of interests is rather impressive, isn't it? Anyway, Pozzo used a technique called perspective painting to create the illusion of walls and domes on flat surfaces. Yes, believe it or not, what you're looking at are all flat surfaces. Next, we can't pass by one of Rome's most famous pre-Christian landmarks, the Pantheon, the temple of all gods. One version of its history claims that the first building was constructed in 25 BC to commemorate Octavian Augustus's victory over the fleet of the famous Antony and Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra. Another version suggests the Pantheon was built a bit later, around 100 AD, during Emperor Trajan's reign. Either way, the Pantheon underwent significant reconstruction after a fire in 110 AD and was completed around 120 AD under Emperor Hadrian, whom I mentioned earlier. It wasn't until 609 AD that the temple was converted into a Christian basilica dedicated to St. Mary and the Martyrs. This happened when the Byzantine Emperor Phocas gifted the temple to Pope Boniface IV, who then had some bones transferred here from the catacombs. The Pantheon's dome is still the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. Although, to be precise, it's not entirely concrete, it's more like cement mixed with a typical Roman travertine and crushed brick. The Pantheon's only window is the oculus in the roof, which creates a rather striking effect when sunlight pours through it. There's even a legend that the dome was supported from within by a heap of sand mixed with coins, and after the concrete has set, the Romans were told about the coins. They quickly dug out all the sand in just a few days. But that, it seems, is just another urban legend. Despite its symbolic significance, the Pantheon was often used just as a source of building materials. As early as 658 AD, bronze sheets from the Pantheon's roof were carted off to Constantinople. And nearly 1,000 years later, in 1624, Pope Urban VIII granted permission to remove and melt down the Pantheon's bronze portico to create the baldachin over the altar in St. Peter's Basilica. The Romans had a quip about this. Quod non feceri barbari, feceri barberini. What the barbarians didn't do, the barbarinis did. To make up for the damage to the Pantheon, the Pope asked Bernini to build 2 bell towers on either side of the portico, which were promptly nicknamed Donkey Ears and were demolished in 1883. Not far from the Pantheon lies the lively and always crowded Piazza Navona. Its elongated shape gives away its original purpose. It was a stadium for athletic contests, known as agons in Greek, a word that has stuck in the name. The square is home to 2 churches, the somewhat inconspicuous San Giacomo degli Spagnoli, which for a long time was Rome's national Spanish church, and the rather ornate Baroque church of Sant'Agnese in Agone, dedicated to St. Agnes. According to legend, the church stands on the site of the brothel where the St. Agnes was allegedly taken. It's actually rather fascinating to think how such tragic stories can be turned into beautiful tales about the death of a 12-year-old girl. But legends aside, the real stars of the square are the 3 fountains, each a masterpiece in its own right. The basins of the 2 outer fountains were designed by Giacomo della Porta, although these works were not his most significant. He's better known for the facade of the Church of the Gesu, which I showed you later, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, and the Church of Santa Maria dei Monti. The sculptures of Neptune, after whom one of the fountains is named, along with the surrounding Nereids, walruses, and cherubs, were created by Antonio della Bitta and Gregorio Zappala in the late 19th century, just added to tie this fountain in with the others on the square. At the opposite end of the square stands the so-called Moor Fountain. Its base, as we've already established, was done by Giacomo della Porta, but the central figure was sculpted by none other than Bernini, while the other figures were added in the 19th century. The centerpiece of the square is the magnificent Fountain of the Four Rivers, crowned with an Egyptian obelisk. Interestingly, the inscriptions on the obelisk aren't Egyptian. While the stone itself is indeed from Egypt, the obelisk was made during Emperor Domitian's reign, and the inscriptions praise Domitian and his divine predecessors, Titus and Vespasian. Initially, Bernini wasn't even allowed to compete for the fountain's design, having fallen out of favor after his failed attempt at building the bell towers for St. Peter's Basilica. The first design for the fountain was done by Francesco Borromini, who actually came up with an idea of surrounding the obelisk with allegorical figures representing great rivers. Bernini, however, used his connections, borrowed, well, let's not mince words here, it was theft, Borromini's idea, and used 1.5 meter silver model to impress Pope Innocent X, who then made the final decision without a competition. The fountain structure rests not on a massive base, but on a rather elegant grotto with a through passage. I won't steal the thunder from the professionals, they'll tell you what the various figures represent, and it's quite fascinating in fact. I'll just say that the human figures at the corners symbolize the 4 great rivers known at the time in the 4 known continents: the Ganges in Asia, the Danube in Europe, the Rio de la Plata in the Americas, and the Nile in Africa. The Amazon was still unknown, and the source of the Nile has not been discovered, so the Nile's head is covered with a cloak. But they did know where to get the water for this fountain. Like the Barcaccia and the Trevi Fountain, which I've already shown you, this one is fed by the same ancient aqueduct, Aqua Virga. As you make your way to the next point, you might pass by the most important Jesuit church in Rome, the Church of the Gesu, where Ignatius Loyola himself is buried and the right hand of St. Francis Xavier is kept. Actually, I've always found the origin of such relics curious. Like a person dies whole, but then part of them is sent elsewhere. How does this even happen? How this decision is made? Like, we need a relic, shall we just chop off a hand then? Now, here's an artifact that has remained almost unchanged for nearly 2000 years. Alright, fine, for about 1900 years. The column was designed by Apollodorus of Damascus. Yes, the name suggests modern-day Syria, but Apollodorus was actually Nabatean, from the same people who built the famous city of Petra. Apollodorus crafted this commemorative column in 113 AD to celebrate the then emperor's victory over the Dacian tribes. The emperor in question was Trajan, and the column is adorned with scenes depicting the key moments of his campaign and triumphs. Essentially, Trajan's column is like an ancient Roman comic strip, recounting Trajan's adventures in what we now call Moldova and Romania. It features 2,500 detailed figures, and Trajan himself appeared there a whopping 59 times. Originally, an eagle was perched atop the column. Later, a statue of Trajan was added. Oddly enough, it wasn't placed there straight away. However, in 1588, Pope Sixtus V decided that a statue of Apostle Peter should replace the pagan emperor. You can actually climb up to the viewing platform just below the statue. The column is hollow inside, and at its base there's a small chamber where once upon a time golden urns containing the ashes of Trajan and his wife Pompeia Plotina were kept. Surrounding the column are the remnants of Rome's last imperial forum, naturally Trajan's Forum. Now, when we talk about a forum in this context, it's not just a single building, it's more like a district, complete with colonnades, a temple, a couple of libraries, and even the Basilica Ulpia, which despite its name wasn't a religious site, but rather a place for legal proceedings, trade, and other official activities. I just wonder whether they herded adoring crowds of praetorians in disguise into the basilica for the emperor's visit. What do you think? There's also one quite unusual thing here. A semicircular building known as Trajan's Market. Its design has even led some historians to call it the very first shopping center in history. But that's not quite accurate. The market was more likely an administrative building, housing various government offices, such as the Annona, the department responsible for the grain supply to Rome. And all that, believe it or not, is just a small bite of what there is to see in Rome. By this point, I was tired. The evening had fallen, darkness had fully settled in, and I decided to continue another day. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I do hope to see you again in the second part of this Roman walk. See you there tomorrow!